So welcome everyone. Good morning. My name is Pam DeWild. I'm the manager of the Pickering Welcome Center and co-executive director of the Durham Region Unemployed Help Center. We're pleased to have everyone with us this morning for this workshop opportunity, and great to have Dean with us as well. Let me just introduce our session this morning. The Durham Region Unemployed Help Center values diversity and inclusion and is committed to the ongoing work of listening and learning. These values reflect action and adaptation, not one-time accomplishment. As an Employment Ontario service provider and lead agency for Welcome Center Immigrant Services in Pickering and the employment support programs in the Durham Welcome Centers, we recognize the ongoing challenges and barriers faced by job seekers, particularly racialized people, newcomers, and others seeking equitable and fair employment. We're committed to supporting and collaborating with organizational leaders like yourself, seeking to create inclusive workplaces. In 2021, Durham Region Unemployed Help Center received funding from Canadian Heritage for the Confronting Racism in Durham project. Funding through the Anti-Racism Action Program provided an opportunity to explore further the lived experience of job seekers, employees, employers, and service providers in Durham Region, and work collaboratively with community partners to move beyond identifying barriers to confronting racism and discrimination. The training session today is among the resources and activities developed during this project to support employers implement inclusive anti-oppressive processes for recruiting, hiring, and building equitable workplaces for everyone. Although we're gathered virtually, I'd like us to take a moment at the beginning of this time together to bring our focus to the places where we each have the privilege of joining from. Let us acknowledge the traditional territory of the Indigenous people who have called the land where we are each joining from home long before the arrival of settlers. Where I'm joining from in Oshawa has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among the Mississauga peoples and is the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. Together today, we honor, recognize, and respect this nation and Indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on where we are meeting today. Dean, let me turn the session over to you. We're grateful for your leadership and skill in teaching, engaging us in this essential work of creating inclusive workplaces and addressing the question of implicit bias. Thank you.
Oh, Pam, you're so kind. And thank you so much for just the warm introduction. But I think more importantly, Pam, I just want to say thank you for the work you do and the work your team does to bring conversations like this to the forefront. And as much as we hear a lot of times, in the media that, conversations about, racism and discrimination, things of that nature, believe it or not, it does not necessarily translate to everybody in the world striving for the same goals. And so I just want to say thank you so much, Pam, for your leadership on this and your team. And I also want to say thank you to everyone that's here. You spending 1 hour of your day is a testament to the fact that this is important to you. And so I just want to say thank you so much for doing so. Just as a quick reminder to everyone that, if you choose to remain on video, this is being recorded. So that is your choice. And also and Pam, I'm not sure if you are able or someone on your team is able to do this, but just in case people are going in and out, I think you are able to mute the sounds of people going in and out. So if we are able to do that, then just so it helps us not to lose concentration and focus on the information we're going to receive. We've got a busy day today. And so I'm going to share my screen with everyone. I'm going to be sharing and speaking for a little bit, but then after I want to involve everyone in the work, and Pam and the team is going to help me with regards to some of the polls that we have. And we're also planning on having a short time of breakout too, so that we can really engage and simulate the work that we're talking about. And, Pam mentioned that, the conversation is really about understanding implicit bias. I like to use this title, Managing Implicit Bias, because I think it's really clear that bias needs to be managed. It's not something you could actually remove, believe it or not. And I don't know if you really even want to remove it. And I think it's the way that we talk about bias a lot of times, we don't really understand what it is. And so my hope is to give you a little bit of background and context to what it actually is, so that we can really navigate removing what I call negative implicit bias. But let's start first with this, because I want to talk about what I call shared agreements. And I think this is really important, especially as we participate together, which I want to start with this conversation, this thought first. Choose your own level of participation disclosure. And I want to say this to everyone. Accept personal responsibility for getting out of the session what you need. As much as I'm going to bring content to you, all of us have to take the responsibility to make sure that we get for ourselves what we need so that we can do our best work. Listen and please, really try to understand rather than just responding. When we go into breakout rooms, I think it's going to be important to say, let's listen to one another. Let's, understand that that's a skill that we all have to develop. And let's really allow people to share without the fear of judgment, because everyone is speaking from their own experiences. And that's why I say what is true for you while being respectful of others, right? Everyone has their own experiences and backgrounds. And so it's really important to listen to what everyone has to say and try to engage in dialogue. Let's not try to debate, but let's respect that everybody's an expert of their own individual experience. Let's give ourselves permission not to make sense. Oh, I got to give myself this permission. Sometimes we get on these calls and we're trying to sound so fancy. We're trying to sound so eloquent. I get it. I want to be as professional as possible. But sometimes I see things even to my own in my head and it just doesn't make sense clearly. And sometimes we do that. And sometimes we share things that we want to make total sense, but sometimes it doesn't come out the right way. I just want to give you all permission, especially when you're sharing, that's okay. Okay, we're all here to learn, and let's be a little bit vulnerable one to another and realize that for some, this conversation is just not easy. So a little bit of discomfort, it's okay. And let's honor confidentiality, especially when we're in groups. If things come out, experiences come out, stories come out that maybe someone is sharing that's real personal, let's just make sure that we honor that confidentiality around the session. To create a safe space takes a lot of time. It takes trust. So I really try not to call these learning experiences in what I call the learning environment a safe space. I call it a brave space, and I call it a brave space because it's just going to it's a place that will allow you to be able to share without the fear of judgment as we're getting to know each other, to create safety over time. And then my final thought on this, just to kind of prepare your minds, is your personal permission to respectfully accept or reject anything during this session. Okay. My goal here is to really bring you awareness that leads to your learning, that leads to behavior change, but you've got the permission to accept that if you'd like. And so I want to just put that out there. And I also like to make mention of the fact that all of us have so many different experiences, intersectionalities, that it's very challenging for me to be able to speak to every point that everyone has. And so by saying that to all of us, I want you to know that I recognize that, I acknowledge that, and I'll do my best to share to make sure that we're creating an inclusive and equitable space. Great. So in terms of today's agenda, we're going to talk about the current climate. We'll talk about some definitions. We're going to go into bias. I'm going to talk about microaggressions. I did that in the last conversation, but I'm going to extend it a little bit. And then after, give us some personal goals that we need to move forward with. All right, so let's get into it. In our last session, I stated this, and I think it's so important because we've got to think about what's been happening in our world over the last few years. I mean, as I've mentioned, a global pandemic, it's rocked, it's shaped our world like never before. We've seen this rise of social injustice that's affecting different community groups, and we see, this rise against, specific groups, like, for example, those who identify as Black, whether it's in, police brutality, whether it's within employment or in the criminal justice system. We're seeing, these disparities happen, and also the conversations about discrimination and racism. And again, it's not just happening towards one group. I really consider just over the last few years, just all of the discoveries of unmarked graves. I believe in Saskatoon, it was about 715 unmarked graves of Indigenous children who were murdered in residential schools. Like, these things are unfathomable to me that have happened in our society that we call Canada, but it really brings to our mind and our attention the fact that this is a reality. And even thinking about, other communities like our Asian community over the last few years, who's really been experiencing conversations of racism that have been geared towards them. Yesterday in particular, I was speaking to a friend of mine from the Asian community who was just sharing some experiences as of recent, and people literally saying to her, go back to China. What? Yeah, I mean, in Canada, go back to China. And so these are not just pictures that I'm sharing with us, these are actual realities of the experiences that people have been experiencing. And maybe even you who are on this call, for your religious beliefs, for your culture beliefs, for what you think, you've experienced personal discrimination that's affected your life personally, and it translates into the workplace, right? Think about this thought. Quick, hire one. Because the way that our mind functions from a perspective of stereotyping or being prejudicial and even discriminating, a lot of times it's very, very easy for us to look at people who are maybe both are very skilled and qualified, but based upon how we have stereotyped groups, we can quickly think, oh, I think so-and-so might be a better fit for a role. And that's how these images and thoughts have really, really portrayed. And we've seen inequitable hiring or inequitable career development, particularly for those who have been traditionally marginalized. And so I want to ask you all a question. I'm going to invite you to open up your chat function right now. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'd like you to, if possible, to please write in your chat, a word based off of this next question, which is this: what is one word describing how you were feeling after you've heard about circumstances involving racism and discrimination? If you could share a word to describe how you were feeling, we would love to hear it together. And thank you so much for starting to share. We really appreciate it. Anger. I'm seeing anger. I'm seeing sadness, being uncomfortable, tired, confused, hopeless. These are real feelings. And please feel free to continue to share that we all are experiencing. I remember when I saw the murder of George Floyd in the media the day after it had occurred. And I remember for me personally, what I was feeling when I had seen his murder, and this might sound a little strange to you, but you'll kind of get it, especially those if you're on this call who identify as Black. I felt desensitized. And when I use that term desensitized, I use it in the context of, I've seen Black individuals murdered in the media, not in the movies, but in the media so often that it almost becomes like it's a Hollywood movie. And I remember personally that week working with clients, working with people. And, no one really asked me, how am I doing? There was no real conversation about that. It was just business as usual, professionalism as usual, just getting the work done. And I think about how many people, especially those who at that time identified as Black, how many people just came to work, put their head down, and it was like nothing had happened. And I remember that Friday, I was in a call with some North American diversity leaders, and they said, hey, let's forget about our agenda. Let's put the elephant in the room. And I was one of two Black men. And I remember on that call, they asked me, how are you doing? And I'm telling you this. After oppressing and suppressing my feelings, in that moment, I began to express, and I felt anger, all this frustration, all these emotions start to come out of me. And I realized something. I realized that I've actually forgotten about me, and I've literally given myself over to be what I call quote unquote Canadian, to be to act like everything is okay. And so the reason I got you to share It's because I want you to know it's okay for us to express these feelings and these emotions because they are real. And I'm thanking you all for doing that in this conversation. So with that said, I want to just redefine or define again, just for the sake of maybe new listeners, what these terms mean, especially because they've come up so often in different conversations. When we talk about diversity, we're really talking about the unique characteristics that make us all up as individuals and as human beings. And so I want everyone to understand that it doesn't matter who you are on this call, whether you are a white straight male, whether you identify as Asian on this call. Every single one of us, believe it or not, have characteristics that make us up as human beings. Now, we understand that there are people who have been traditionally marginalized versus those that would be considered in Western society the dominant group. But it doesn't mean that even among the dominant group, there are still invisible characteristics that make up what we call diversity. So I want us to all understand, starting in this call, that this conversation is not about one group versus another. It's actually about all of us working together to make sure that people in our workspaces, new employees, current employees, people that are job seekers, we want to make sure everyone feels included and that they feel that they can be hired in a fair manner, come into our workplaces, be productive, do their best work, and be their authentic selves with their feelings and their emotions. And it's in that place when people actually feel included, where intrinsically they feel what they call a sense of belonging. You know, I feel psychologically safe here. I feel like I I've built trust and camaraderie. And when people feel that sense of belonging, they're actually willing to promote their organizations. In a study that was done by a company called BetterUp, 167% more than anyone else. And so because we have, employer agencies here, we've got employers. Can I tell you your best strategy for recruitment? It's not just putting up a job ad on LinkedIn or Indeed. Your best strategy is to make sure your people feel included. So when they feel like they belong, they're willing to promote your organization more than anyone else, believe it or not. That's a conversation for another day. But the next thought though is, and what we really have been talking about, is this word equity, right? Because what we're saying is this, is that in our society, we've got a dominant group who, takes advantage of different privileges, benefits. Then we've got those who have been traditionally marginalized, whether it's people from racialized groups, different sexual orientations, etc. And so what we're saying is that we want to ensure that we see fairness for all. It doesn't matter if you have a gut feeling about that candidate. Everyone deserves an opportunity if they're skilled and they are qualified. I talk about intersectionalities and want everyone to recognize that we all have different intersectionalities. I've mentioned some of mine in the previous call, and I'll do it again just so you understand how this breaks down. I'll talk about me. From a sex perspective, I'm considered a biological male. From a gender perspective, I'm a straight man. From a religious perspective, I'm a person of faith. From an age perspective, I'm middle-aged now. From a disability perspective, I actually have a a medical condition that you may not be aware of and you can't see, but I actually have one. From an ethnicity perspective, I'm born in Canada. My mom is Jamaican. My father's from an island called St. Vincent, but his heritage is Portuguese. And that's where you get the name Del Peach from, which is originally Del Pesh, but my father had his name changed in the UK by the UK government to Del Peach. So there's only a few of us in the world. That's how I find out all of my siblings that I didn't know from the past. Just a little joke there. But the point being is that you would never know that I have a Portuguese heritage unless you talked with me. And that's why I'm trying to make everybody understand, as we build relationships and get to know people, we get to know that people have so many dimensions of diversity or so many intersectionalities. And that's why this conversation is about all of us working together. Why does it matter? Because everyone deserves to feel valued for who they are. It doesn't matter who you are. Everyone deserves to feel like they belong. Everyone deserves an equitable opportunity within our workspaces. You and both I deserve to feel valued regardless of where we are in life. And so really kind of coming down and thinking about this conversation, we really need to ask ourselves some questions, which is, why? Why do we make stereotypical or prejudicial judgments about other? How can this lead to discrimination? Why does our brain make assessments about our world around us? How does our minds make classifications and judgments? right, about our world. As humans, we naturally group people into categories. And sometimes, we make intentional or unintentional judgments about individuals, institutions, or groups. And sometimes, they could be in favor of those groups, and sometimes they might be negative or from a defensive view. And this is what we define as bias, right? It's prejudicial treatment in favor of one group versus another. It can be against institutions, it can be against groups. But the thing about bias, and this is what I want you all of us to understand, is bias actually helps us to navigate in the world. It helps us to defend ourselves or to even be defensive, right? So an example of that is, maybe there is an area that is high in crime. You typically may not want to go to that area, or you want to protect yourself within that area only because, statistically it's high in crime, right? Now, there might be certain demographics that are in that area. Now, it doesn't mean to stereotype those demographics as people in that group are all criminals or people, because it's not true. But it actually helps us to navigate and defend ourselves. So these are things that we have to be aware of. But bias could either be conscious, which is explicit or overt, or bias could be unconscious, which is implicit or under the surface and comes up, right, at different times when we are faced in different situations. So I want to show you how it plays out and how it can play out in a negative sense, and sometimes how we can even think with positive intent towards it as well. And I'll give you an example. Stereotypes, right, are generalizations about a group, okay, in which all have identical characteristics and we all assign. So sometimes we might say all Black people are the same, okay? And I'm using that identity because I identify as Black. So then what we do is we create what we call prejudicial thoughts around it. It actually can be positive or it can be negative. So I'm going to give you an example of where it might seem positive. Some people will say all Black people are good athletes, okay? Now, where that conversation becomes bad is when you compare athletes and say that athletes are not academic. But if you want to say, for example, all Black people are athletes, in a sense, it's not a necessarily bad thing, right? But it's not true though, right? Because not all Black people are great athletes. Like when you say, for example, all basketball players are Black. No, that's not true. There's basketball players from all different walks of life. But that feeling may not necessarily be intended with negativity. It might be looked at upon from a positive perspective. But where we get a negative judgment, right, is when we think about things in a judgmental way that actually generalizes groups and creates these beliefs and these stereotypes. And when those generalizations are now put into action in a negative sense, and we treat people in a negative way, then what happens is we begin to categorize people. And so people can be discriminated based upon the grounds of race, age, or sex, etc. So let me give you an actual example. Okay, we talked about belief being a stereotyping being a belief about a group or an institution. So look at this example. In our industry, men appear to be better candidates than women because they are better at building rapport and making clients comfortable. So some people have stereotyped, let's say, sales organizations to believe that men are better salespeople than women, which is absolutely not true. Absolutely false. But some people have this belief. Why? Because they think that men could build better rapport or make clients comfortable. So let's look at how this becomes prejudice. In Mary's interview, she seemed too formal and uptight, even though she has the skills. Not sure she will work well with our clients. Listen to this part. John and I have built a rapport so quickly since we both play golf, and I think he would be a better fit. What is wrong with this example? Well, in this example, Mary has the skills. In this example, there is no mention of John's skills, but the interviewer classified Mary into a category that said that she was too formal and uptight, and then said, well, because me and John, play golf, I think he'd be a better fit for the role, right? This is how bias plays out in a negative sense, particularly in workplaces, in our systems, in our hiring, in different things that we do. Now, here's where discrimination happens. I would rather hire John because he will make a better fit for our clients. And so a lot of times, employers, we make decisions like this in a very, very rapid fashion And the reality is these decisions over time cause disparities in our organizations, which create what I call systemic and institutional discrimination, which is a form of discrimination or racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. And this is how it becomes reflected in wealth, in our income, in our criminal justice, and even in employment, right? These are things that we need to consider. And what ends up happening is we create these systems in our organizations that cause people to be able to freely discriminate, even though a lot of times these biases that we have are at what we call an unconscious level. And this perpetuates the privilege that that people may have, particularly in the dominant group, because we all have privilege, believe it or not, but there are greater advantages, especially for those in the dominant group. And so I give you an example. If an individual is if most hiring managers are particularly from what we call the dominant group, or in the Western society, we'll use the term a white background. A lot of times when those individuals are developing somewhere in their career, or a lot of times when they are hiring an individual, they're looking for someone who is like them. And so a lot of times that creates disparities, right? And this is something that has been statistically proven in research. So this is why it's important for us to become aware of what these concepts mean. So in the next slide, I'm going to ask a question, and Pam is going to help me with a poll, and I want you all to participate. And I'm going to tell you why, because I really want everyone to get a view of everyone else's experiences with this poll. Which is the question is this: have you ever experienced, or do you believe that prejudice and discrimination based on identity occurs in the workplace? I would love for all of you to participate and answer this poll. Do you believe that prejudice and discrimination based on identity occurs in the workplace? Thank you so much, everybody, for helping support and answering. We really appreciate it. This is great participation so far. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And Pam, when you're ready, you can feel free to close the poll. So everybody, I want to show you the results. And I want us to think about this. On this call, 95% of the people on this call have said, I've personally experienced discrimination, or I am aware of discrimination and prejudice that's happened based upon identity in the workplace. And then we've got 5% of people saying, I think it was discrimination, but I'm not sure. I really wish we were all in the last category, where no, not at all. I really, really wish discrimination never, ever happened. But this is a testament as to why we're talking about this conversation, because it shows us the reality that not just us on this call face, but others that we work with or sit beside, colleagues, people that we're hiring might face. And this is why we are here, to make sure that we can help support and create more inclusive and equitable environments. So thank you so much for that. Let's continue. Let's talk about bias a little bit more. Okay. And let's kind of break it down to a few different examples of bias and how bias can play out. If you do a Google search, you could probably see tons of different types of biases, but really when you boil it down, they kind of all come around these four different areas. So the first one we look at is what we call anchoring bias, right? And it's when you anchor your first opinion about someone, even though it may not be correct. So let's say, for example, your company just hired an individual who is from a certain demographic. And let's say in the past, maybe on the playground, you've had a negative experience with someone from that demographic. So that person sends you an email for the very first time, and you are a perfectionist. And in that email, you notice 3 grammatical errors. And the first thing you anchor about that person is that they are not intelligent, they're not smart, they don't have good grammar skills, etc., etc., etc. Now, let's say that person sends you 50 more emails, and each email is absolutely perfect. There's no issues, there's nothing in those emails that's wrong. You still in your mind have this anchored belief about that person based on the fact that you've had negative experiences in the past with that demographic and based on the fact of your first interaction with that person. But it doesn't mean that they're unintelligent, they're not smart, or they don't have use of proper grammar. It was just one email. Let's talk about in-group bias. In-group bias plays out a lot, right, in our workplaces, particularly in hiring. Think about, for example, the fact that you might have 5 candidates in your candidate pool. 2 of those candidates, they look like you, they're from the same neighborhood, they play the same activities, your children are involved in similar type of functions, and the other 3 just might be different candidates, all from different backgrounds, cultures, walks of life. All of them together, right, are skilled and qualified, but you place more weight in your interview and more of your quote unquote gut feeling and intuition on those candidates that are more like you, because you think that they'll be a better, what we call, fit for our organization. The problem is we want too many fits in our organization, and what we don't want is we don't want more cultural additions. Friends, if we want to see greater innovation, productivity, and performance, we've got to get people who are going to add. What are you missing on your team that you really, really need? That's how we need to be thinking. We don't just need fits. We need people who can add and bring themselves to the workplace. Let's talk about attribution bias. I like this one. I really, really, really like this one. Can we have, even though this is a serious topic, let's have a little bit of fun with this one. Open up your chat again. I'm going to ask you a question, okay? And I really, really want you all to answer this question. How many of you on this call have what we call road rage? I want you just to put a yes, a no, a maybe in the chat. Road rage is that if someone cuts you off, you're angry, you're mad, you're screaming. How many of you have road rage? Put that in the chat. Let us know in this call. Okay, some people are honest. Sometimes, no, don't drive. Okay, sometimes, all right. Oh yeah, okay, there we go. That's what I'm talking about. Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating. We really, really appreciate it. So let's say you're driving down the street and, you are the perfect driver, right? So you're driving down the street. All of a sudden, someone comes and cuts you off, right? And they just go about their way. Well, if you've got road rage, you're mad, you're screaming, you are angry, at this person. I've seen some really, really bad road rage. And some people take road rage so far that what ends up happening is that if they pull up beside that car at a stoplight, they'll look in the car, look at who the person is, and sometimes when they look, they say, "Oh, you're from that demographic. Oh, that people from that demographic can't drive." Now, if you're being honest and you drive, even if you don't drive, that possibly that's happened or come up in your mind in the past. But when you do the same thing, you don't attribute the same behavior. Now, and also, before I even get to that, we don't know what was going on with that person in the car. That person might be a perfect driver too, but maybe in that moment, maybe they had a medical condition that, caused them to black out and they cut you off. What if they just heard some really, really bad news, or they're in an emergency trying to bring someone to a hospital? We don't know what's going on with them. Now you're driving down the road and you cut somebody off. You don't attribute the same passion of anger towards yourself that you would towards somebody else. And that's what attribution bias does, right? It makes us look at other people and classify them in different groups, even though we might do the exact same thing. Something to think about. And then the last one, confirmation bias. And using that first example of the person who sent you the email, right? Let's say, for example, again, that person sent you an email, or let's even say you met someone for the first time. And when you met that person for the first time, let's say, you had that gut feeling about them that something's not right with that person. Okay, great. So you have that gut feeling about that individual. And then all of a sudden, what occurs is that you begin to think that this person, there's something wrong with them. Now, for the next 6 months, they do great work at the company. Everybody loves them. There's no issues. But then let's say something happens to them in their life personally and it affects them at work. And you hear about it. The first thing you say is, "I told you so. I knew something was wrong with them," even though they were just having a bad day. So confirmation bias, it just confirms your gut feeling, but that person might have just been having a bad day like we all have in life. And so it's really, really important for us to understand how these things play out. So let's think about how they play out in the workplace, right? Starting with examples like this. I don't think women make good leaders. They are too emotional. What about this next one? If we hire for diversity, we're not making changes to our work activities to make the new hire feel welcome. Golf on Fridays or drinking in the office, we're not changing. It's up to the candidate to fit in. How about this one? He is very skilled in his work and he clarifies his ideas, but his accent may cause problems with communicating to some of our teams. Not sure he's the right fit for the role. Can I hang out here for a sec? My friends, can I tell you something? How many times have we all heard someone who's been rejected for a job and the reason they were rejected because they didn't have enough Canadian experience? They might be super skilled and qualified from wherever they're from, but they didn't have enough Canadian experience. Or someone says, I can't really understand that person. Can I tell you something? Accents are beautiful. Listen, if you come from Asia, if you come from Africa, if you come from Latin America, it doesn't matter where you come from. Accents are beautiful. But you see, in our world today, when it comes to accents, we kind of hold positivity towards accents that are more British in sounding. So let's say whether you're from the UK, maybe even somewhat potentially Ireland, South Africa, or Australia, we kind of put those accents on a pedestal and everything else is not. Can I tell you, friends? First of all, language is such a beautiful thing. It is beautiful to hear the expression of an accent, but even more, if someone has learned another language, particularly English, and English is their second language, you think about how many languages you know. Right? That tells you how proficient somebody is in their ability to learn and adapt, right? These are things that we need to think about. And so I share with you, accents are an amazing thing. Let's not eliminate people based upon that and discriminate. This last one, I know it sounds a little raw, but why is she being so direct and aggressive than what is normal? She's probably on her menstrual cycle. Now, the reason why I put all of these examples here is not because I just kind of thought them in my brain. These are real examples of situations that have actually occurred in workplaces with clients I have worked with who have given me these as examples. So all to say, friends, these are things that we need to all be aware of. Let me kind of run through. I think it's really, really important. I said I was going to mention microaggressions. And they're the everyday slights, the indignities, the put downs, the things like go back to China. Well, that's a little bit overt. For example, I have the chart that I used last time. You speak really good English for an immigrant, right? Or why haven't you found a husband yet? You were born in Canada. These are different things that might not seem as overt in nature, but they're definitely indignities and conversations that cause inequities that we all need to recognize, right? That last one, you are so articulate. How many people have I spoken to who are from racialized groups that when they're speaking and they're just talking like everybody else, someone turns to them and says, "Oh, you are so articulate." Like, what do you mean I'm so articulate? I'm just like anyone else, right? But these are things that we need to be aware of. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about some things that we can do. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but I want to talk about some ways that we can combat microaggressions, which I think is really, really important. Let's start with this first one, right? Restating or paraphrasing. So if someone speaks and says a microaggression, one thing we can say is, "I think I heard you saying this. Is that correct?" Because what you're doing is you're bringing it to their attention, right? And you're allowing them to think, "Oh my gosh, I didn't really mean to say it like that," and giving people the opportunity to really be able to change, because that's what we want people to do. How about this next one? Ask for clarification, right? Could you say more about what you mean by that? How have you come to think that, right? Those are things that we can do. When people may say something, that's a way of responding. What about this one? Acknowledge the feelings behind the statement, right? So express empathy and compassion. Oh, it sounds like you're really frustrated or nervous or angry about X. I can understand that you're upset when you feel disrespected, right? Try to understand and be empathetic. What about this next one? Separating the intent from the impact, because remember, right, when it comes to microaggressions, most people, they don't have a negative intent, but doesn't mean that the impact is still not relevant, right? I mentioned this example in our last conversation. If someone steps on your toe and breaks it, they can say, I'm sorry, I didn't really mean to do that. The intent wasn't there, but it doesn't mean your toe's not broken still. So the impact is still present. So what about this? I know you didn't realize this, but when you said X, it was hurtful because of Y. Instead, you could have said it like this, right? Giving them the opportunity to use different language or different behavior. Let's do one more. Sharing your own process. So how about this? I noticed that when you had said this or done this or made this comment, well, guess what? I've said that also, but I learned to say things like this, right? There is a host of different responses and ways that we can consider and approach, um, um, combating what I call microaggressions, right? I want to talk to you about deconstructing bias, and then we're going to spend about 7 minutes in groups together. And it starts first when we're thinking about how do I deconstruct my own bias? I've got a bias towards a group. How do I start to deconstruct it? Well, here's what it starts with, what I call conscious awareness. So I want to let you know from when you were born until you were 5 years old, all of us, every single one of us, our parents, our guardians, and our environments have shaped the world around us. Things that you heard said about groups, different people, it has all shaped our minds. And so I mentioned earlier that, a part of my identity is I have a medical condition. So let's say, for example, you were on the playground and you saw a child who might have a physical impairment, which is a disability to them. So because they have this physical impairment, you might have learned maybe from your environment, your guardians, your parents, from the media, whatever it is, that people with physical impairments might not be able to play as well as other kids. So then after you exclude that person from playing with your friend group, now that person might be able to play just as well because they've got the appropriate accommodations to help them. But you in your mind have thought that. So let's say as an adult now, you recognize that, okay, well, persons with disabilities, they are able to perform and outperform even more than people who are what we call able-bodied. But when it comes to you hiring people, if you've got 5 people in your hiring group and one of them needs an accommodation, immediately your mind begins to think, oh, that person might not be able to perform the task that I want them to because I've got to get this project done. Maybe it's better to go with the other 4 candidates before going with that person. Not realizing that the accommodation they need is what helps them to perform even just as well or even better than anyone else. So it's really, really important to think that. So let's say your bias is you have a bias towards individuals with disabilities. Number one, it starts with being conscious about it. Become aware that you've got that. Understand the root causes of it and do what I call make a personal mission. Does it come from your childhood? Does it come from a negative experience you had with a different group? Figure out where that came from and then just admit it. I do have it. I've got this bias. We've all got biases. I'm telling you, my friends, right? Um, just one quick one. For example, if you see a group of Black people huddled in a corner with Black hoodies on, immediately, a lot of people, the first thing they think in their mind, that some criminal activity is going on. Oh, people are selling drugs over there in that corner. But friends, seriously, those people, those individuals whom I identify as Black, excuse me, they may be cold. And so that's why they have hoodies on. And then secondly, how do you know they're not talking about their PhD research papers, right? That they've been working on over the last week. You don't know, but that's how our mind reflects. So you've got to make a personal mission that you have been stereotypical and even prejudicial towards certain groups. And then understand your own dimensions of diversity and think about, hey, if someone can actually treat me negatively because the fact I'm a female, because I'm from the LGBTQ community, because of X, Y, and Z, whatever it could be, my religion, right? Think of your own dimensions of diversity, which is in turn to help you become more empathetic. And then this is what I think everyone needs to do. Make steps towards being more culturally aware. If you have typically stereotyped certain groups, right? Because that's what you've learned in your past, start to learn more about those groups, understand their plight, understand what they've had to go through, do some research on YouTube, watch an article, read a book, learn more about those groups and make steps to become more aware of those groups and those cultures. And then also recognize who your in-group is. If you're used to hanging around with a certain group of people that are like you, start to expand and realize that you've got to reach out and create opportunities to make different relationships. I'm going to pause there. And so we've got a little activity that I really want you all to do. If you could all we'll take like about 5 minutes. It's a real quick question. Pam, if you wouldn't mind just breaking us all into groups, and then after we'll get everybody. I know, friends. I know you didn't have a lot of time. Forgive me. I'm so sorry. There's just so much content, and I'm just like, I'm trying to deliver everything as much as possible. So forgive me. But group one, let's start with you. What was your thoughts on the excerpt there? Group one.
Are we group one? Pam, was I in group one? We're in group one. Okay. So thank you, Nemos, put it in. What is our culture? To check if statement is valid. Diversity. What additional trade diversity what that person can bring, the gap, the representative that person can bring. To ask the person to more information. What do they think our cultural fit? Assuming something about our culture to get them to explain. Did I get it all?
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Group number two. That's Alana's group. Alana, Ashley, Bargavi, David, Jamila. Well, there's only 2 groups. Okay, cool.
He spent a bit of time staring at each other, trying to figure out what to do next.
Anyone want to make any comments on that? Okay, that's fine. I know you only had a short time, so I completely understand. Let me share
next time don't put all the introverts in the same group.
That's all good. Let me just share my screen one more time. And let's look at an example of something that we can do in a situation like that. Okay, you're on a hiring committee and a colleague rules out a woman of color because she's not a good cultural fit. Here's something that you can think about of what to do. When someone rules out a candidate because of fit, ask them to be more specific. And a lot of times, especially recruiters, we don't necessarily, I'm going to use the term fight back with our managers, only because a lot of times we say, it's the manager's way, but a lot of times managers actually want to be challenged. And so ask them to be a little bit more specific. And if thinking, boils down to, well, she's different, again, point out difference, might be a good thing. And propose that you could look for someone who adds, right, to the team dynamic. And that's why I talked about earlier, cultural addition, right, which is really, really important instead of someone who just simply fits in. And a lot of times that's how teams are built, right? Homogenous teams are typically built by finding people who fit in, who are like them, who are similar in mindset. But as an organization begins to grow, you need to have difference, because difference is what innovates. I say this one thing to everybody, and then after, I'm going to share one more poll, and then we're going to move forward. Think about every innovation. Think about every invention that was created. It happened because someone thought in their head, how can we be more efficient to do this? How can we do this in a better way? That's diversity. It's just thinking about something in a different manner in order to really ensure that we have the most efficient thing. So those are some things that you can think about and that you can do. And I appreciate you going in your breakout groups. I've got one more poll, and then I'm going to hand it over to Pam to finalize. But Pam, if you could put this up, would love to get your thoughts, everybody on this call. What is one area you would focus on to reduce and manage negative implicit bias? One area that you would focus on. Would love to hear your thoughts on this. real quick, everyone. And so while you're completing this poll, I want to say two things. The first one is I was saying to Pam during the breakout session, like how many slides I had to skip. There's just so much content. But so I do apologize if any of you felt like I was rushing through any of the content. It wasn't the intent to rush through. I just wanted to make sure I covered enough ground within this 1 hour. And then the second thing I'm going to say is thank you. Thank you for taking the time. Oh, I'm so grateful that I've got about 20 other people, almost 25 people on this call who are with me on this journey to create more inclusive and equitable workplaces. And so I just want to say thank you so much to everyone. And Pam, as you share the results, you know, what really, really impresses me is I asked you for one area, but over 65% of you want to do every single thing you can to reduce and manage negative bias. And so I just want to clap and cheer you all on and say thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to hand it back to Pam. Thank you so much.
Yes, let's use our reactions and just give a hands up, a thumbs up, a heart, whatever that is, a cornucopia of confetti to say thank you to Dean. You create such a welcoming space, and I just love how generous you are with your time, with your ideas, and just welcoming us into this conversation. So thank you so much, Dean. It's been a pleasure working with you over this project, and I know we will continue to cross paths and look for opportunities to bring your expertise to our team at the Unemployed Help Center, but also do what we can to continue collaborating with other organizations in this space. So thank you.